He thought he'd found a lost child in a blizzard. Then her mother walked through his gates with evidence that someone inside Nolan's empire had ordered her husband's death, and now they were coming to finish the job. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. It was one of those nights when even the snow felt heavy. Not the kind of heavy that bends branches and silences roads, though it did both of those things. This was a different weight, the kind that settles somewhere behind a man's sternum and stays there, pressing quietly, reminding him of every version of himself he's tried to bury. Nolan Stevens had driven this forest road 100 times. He knew every bend, every gap in the tree line where the wind sharpened into something almost deliberate. He drove it the way he did everything, with his hands steady and his expression giving nothing away. The blizzard had come in fast. What had been a clean evening 2 hours ago was now a wall of white pressing against his headlights. The kind of storm that made the world shrink to whatever the beams could reach. The trees on either side stood loaded with snow, their branches bowed low like men who had given up standing straight. The road ahead disappeared into gray static. Nolan didn't mind. He preferred nights like this. Fewer people moved in bad weather, fewer complications. He had come from a meeting, the kind that required him to sit at the head of a long table and say very little while men twice his age tried to read his face for permission. They never got it. His face had stopped giving things away around the time he was 26, after the third time someone he trusted used what they saw there against him. Now, at 34, his expression operated like a sealed room. Whatever lived inside it wasn't available for inspection. His black coat, double-breasted, structured across the shoulders, was still buttoned to the collar, despite the car's heat. Habit. The tattoos climbing his neck caught the pale light from the dashboard, dark ink coiling upward from beneath his collar toward his jaw. His hands on the wheel showed more of the same ink across his knuckles, down his fingers, marks collected over years that told a story he rarely told out loud. He was not a man people described as warm. He was not a man people described at all, unless they were being careful about who was listening. The radio was off. He drove in silence because silence was the only thing that didn't ask anything of him. He was thinking not about the meeting, which was already filed and processed, but about something older. Something he kept in a corner of himself that he rarely visited. A girl in a yellow coat. A hospital corridor. The particular sound of a door closing with a finality that had nothing to do with hinges. His younger sister had been 12 when he failed to protect her. He had been 17. Old enough to know better. Young enough to believe that wanting to protect someone was the same as being able to. He didn't finish the thought. He never finished it. Because that was the moment his headlights found her. He saw the pink first, an impossible color against all that white and black and gray. A small shape pressed against the base of a large pine tree, partially hidden, partially not, as though she had tried to disappear into the bark and hadn't quite made it. His foot moved to the brake before his mind issued the instruction. The vehicle slowed, stopped, the engine idled. Nolan sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then he cut the engine and opened the door. The cold hit him immediately. Not the managed chill of an air-conditioned room, but something with intention. Something that pushed through fabric and found skin. The snow was coming sideways now, driven by a wind that moved through the trees with a low, sustained sound like distant traffic. His shoes sank into several inches of fresh powder as he stepped out. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip. He didn't call back to anyone he'd driven alone tonight, which he rarely did. Another decision that would later feel less like coincidence and more like design. He walked toward the tree slowly. She was small. Far too small for a night like this. Far too small for a forest like this. The pink coat she wore was the kind made for school mornings and brief walks between warm buildings, not for blizzards, not for forests, not for whatever had brought her here. Her hands were bare, her hair blonde, fine was damp and pressed flat against her cheeks by the wind. She sat with her back against the tree's broad trunk and her knees pulled up, and she was holding a teddy bear against her chest with both arms, gripping it the way people grip the last solid thing available to them. Her eyes found him before he expected them to. Blue. Wide. Exhausted with a depth that had no business being in a child's face. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked at him the way people look at something they've already decided they can't escape. Not with surrender, exactly, but with a kind of terrible stillness. Her cheeks were red from cold, her lips pale at the edges. She was shivering in long, continuous waves that her small body couldn't stop. Nolan crouched down. Not all the way, just enough to bring himself closer to her level, enough to stop looming. He kept his hands where she could see them. He didn't know why he did that. He just did. "Hey," he said. His voice came out low. Careful. Unfamiliar to him in its gentleness. "You're all right. No one's going to hurt you." She stared at him. Her grip on the bear tightened. The wind moved through the trees above them, shaking loose a cascade of snow from the branches. Neither of them looked up. Then she spoke, barely audible. 4 words shaped by a voice so small it seemed wrong that it had to carry something so heavy. "Mommy said hide here." Nolan held very still. He looked past her, into the dark between the trees. Nothing moved that he could see, but in 15 years of operating in spaces where danger disguised itself as ordinary, he had learned that the absence of visible threat was not the same as safety. He didn't think. He reached up and unbuttoned his coat, pulling it from his shoulders in one motion, and leaned forward to wrap it around her. It swallowed her completely, pooling around her in the snow, absurdly large, warm from his body. She let him do it. That was the thing. She let him. He looked at her face. She was still watching him, still clutching the bear, but the terrible stillness had shifted barely, almost imperceptibly, into something else. Not trust, not yet. Just the faint, fragile possibility of it. Nolan Stevens, feared, sealed, untouchable, knelt in the snow beside a child who had no idea what he was, and felt something fracture very quietly in the place he kept sealed. He didn't understand it then. He would. Nobody spoke on the drive back. Nolan had carried her to the vehicle the way he might carry something irreplaceable, carefully, without rushing. One arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, his coat still wrapped around her small frame. She hadn't protested. She hadn't asked where they were going. She had simply rested her cheek against his chest, with the exhausted trust of someone who had run out of options, and decided, without fully understanding why, that this was the one that might hold. He had noticed her shoes were missing. Bare feet in a blizzard. He didn't let himself think too long about what that meant, about what kind of night had preceded this moment, about what she had run through to end up against that tree. He turned the heat to maximum and drove without speaking, checking the mirror every few minutes. She sat in the passenger seat, far too small for it, the seatbelt draped across her like an afterthought, and watched the dark trees pass with eyes that were slowly losing their battle against sleep. She was still holding the bear. She fell asleep 7 minutes from the estate. The gates opened before he reached them. His security had been watching, they always were, and by the time he pulled into the main drive, 2 of his men were already waiting near the entrance, their expressions professionally unreadable. They were good at that. He had trained them to be. But when he stepped out of the vehicle and opened the passenger door to lift the sleeping child from the seat, he saw it, the brief, involuntary flicker that crossed both their faces. Confusion. And beneath it, something almost human. "Get Mrs. Harlan," Nolan said quietly. His estate manager, 60 years old, no nonsense, the only person on his staff who had ever spoken to him without choosing her words like she was diffusing something. "Tell her I need the east guest room prepared, warm, and I need food, something simple. Soup." Neither man moved immediately. He looked at them. They moved. Mrs. Harlan appeared at the top of the entrance steps before he reached them, already pulling her cardigan tight, already assessing the situation with the particular efficiency of a woman who had managed this household through things she had chosen not to ask questions about. Her eyes went to the child in his arms, then to his face, then back to the child. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Follow me." The east guest room was warm by the time they reached it, underfloor heating, heavy drapes already drawn, a lamp casting soft amber light across a bed that was, by any measure, far too large for someone so small. Mrs. Harlan turned down the sheets with quiet precision, while Nolan set the girl down gently. She stirred, but didn't wake. The bear was still in her grip. "Her feet," Nolan said. Mrs. Harlan had already seen them. She left without being asked, and returned with a basin of warm water, a towel, and the kind of calm that suggested she had made a private decision not to let this moment unsettle her. She tended to the child's feet, checking carefully, warming them gradually while Nolan stood near the doorway and watched. He wasn't sure why he stayed. He told himself it was protocol. Someone had to make decisions if the child woke frightened. He stayed because he couldn't make himself leave. She woke 40 minutes later. Not with a scream, with a sharp intake of breath and eyes that went immediately to every corner of the room, cataloging, assessing, in a way that no child should know how to do. Then she found him. He was sitting in the chair near the window, jacket off, forearms resting on his knees, watching her. The lamp between them made the tattoos on his hands and neck more visible, dark and elaborate against his skin. And he wondered, briefly, how frightening he looked in the low light. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she held the bear out slightly toward him, the way children offer things to prove they mean no harm. Something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, small and careful. The soup arrived. She ate with both hands wrapped around the bowl, stealing glances at him between spoonfuls. He didn't push for conversation. He had interrogated men with iron nerve in rooms designed to break them. He knew that silence, applied correctly, was more powerful than pressure. But this was different. This silence was something he was protecting, not using. When the bowl was almost empty, she spoke. The men were arguing. Her voice was small but deliberate, like she had rehearsed this. Really loud. Mommy grabbed my hand and we ran outside, and she said, she paused, pressed her lips together. She said, "Don't move and don't make a sound no matter what." Nolan kept his expression still. "And then she didn't come back," the girl finished. Not crying. Past crying, maybe. Just reporting. He leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" She considered him. "Gracelyn." "Gracelyn." He said it back the way you repeat something you want to remember accurately. "My name is Nolan. You're safe here, Gracelyn. I promise you that." She looked at him with those blue eyes measuring something, weighing it with an instinct that children sometimes have before the world teaches them to ignore it. "You have a lot of drawings on your hands," she said. "I do. Does it hurt?" It did. Not anymore. She seemed to accept this. She set the bowl down and pulled the bear back against her chest and looked at him with an expression so earnest it was almost unbearable. "You're not scary," she said quietly, like she was telling him something she thought he needed to know. Nolan said nothing. He looked at her, this small, impossible thing sitting in his guest room, barefoot and surviving, and felt the fracture from the forest open another degree. He left her to sleep shortly after, walked down the corridor to where his head of security was waiting with a tablet and a tight expression. "I ran her," the man said. He held out the tablet. Nolan took it. He read the name once, then again. Gracelyn Waters. The blood in his veins went very quiet. Waters. He handed the tablet back without a word and walked to the window at the end of the hall. Outside, the blizzard was still coming down, white and relentless and indifferent. Marcus Waters' daughter. The man whose empire Nolan had dismantled. The man whose death, 2 years ago, had been filed under business and closed. That man's daughter had been hiding against a tree in Nolan's forest. He stood at the window for a long time. Then the security system chimed. Cameras at the outer perimeter. Black vehicles, moving slowly up the access road through the snow. Not his. Nolan didn't go to the monitors immediately. He stood at the window for another full minute, watching the blizzard move through the floodlights in the outer yard, white noise, white motion, everything blurring at the edges. The vehicles on the perimeter camera had stopped, not advancing, not retreating, just sitting in the snow with their engines running, headlights cutting 2 pale tunnels through the dark, waiting. He had seen that particular kind of patience before. It wasn't the patience of men who were lost or uncertain. It was the patience of men who were delivering a message simply by being visible. "We know where you are." He turned from the window and walked back down the corridor, past the east guest room where Gracelyn slept, and descended to the lower level where his private office sat behind a reinforced door that looked, from the outside, like it belonged to a study. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, didn't drink it, and sat down. He opened the Marcus Waters file from memory, not a physical file. Not anymore. Everything about Marcus Waters lived in Nolan's head, organized with the same precision he applied to everything that had ever threatened what he built. Marcus Waters had not been a violent man. That was the thing people misunderstood about him, the thing Nolan himself had perhaps misunderstood, or chosen to frame conveniently. Marcus operated in finance. Clean hands, expensive suits, a gift for making money move across borders without attracting the kind of attention that ended careers or lives. He had built a legitimate consulting firm as his front and run his shadow operations through a network of shell accounts that, for nearly a decade, nobody could fully trace. Nolan had traced them. 2 years ago, Marcus Waters' financial architecture had begun intersecting with Nolan's own controlled territories, skimming from shared ventures, rerouting funds through accounts that Nolan's organization had operational interest in. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even particularly bold. But in Nolan's world, quiet theft was still theft, and the response to theft had to be unambiguous, or it became an invitation. He had dismantled Marcus's operation methodically. Frozen accounts, severed alliances, applied pressure at every structural point until the entire enterprise collapsed inward, like a building with its supports removed. Marcus had lost everything in the space of 6 weeks. The death had come 3 weeks after that. A car accident on an icy road outside the city. Black ice, the report said. Single vehicle. No witnesses. Nolan had not ordered it. He had told himself that clearly, at the time, and had believed it. He had dismantled the man's empire. He had not signed a death warrant. Those were different things. He had always maintained that distinction. But sitting now in his office with a glass of undrunk whiskey, and the knowledge that Marcus Waters' daughter had been hiding against a tree in a blizzard less than 2 miles from his estate, that distinction felt considerably less clean. He pulled up everything his team had compiled in the last hour. Gracelyn Waters, 6 years old. Mother. Nina Waters, 31. Previously Nina Calloway before her marriage. No criminal record. No known affiliations beyond her connection to Marcus. She had maintained a low profile since his death, relocated twice, kept Gracelyn out of any public records where possible. By every visible measure, she had been trying to disappear. Someone had found her anyway. And that someone had driven her or chased her to within 2 miles of Nolan's perimeter on the worst night of the winter. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The vehicles outside had not moved. His head of security appeared in the doorway. They pulled back about 10 minutes ago, off the access road, back onto the public route. No contact attempted. Plates? Traced to a leasing company in the city. Company dissolved 8 months ago. Dead end. Nolan nodded slowly. Double the perimeter watch. Nobody approaches the estate without my direct clearance. Nobody. Understood? A pause. The girl is she. She's sleeping. He said it with a finality that closed the question. He went back upstairs at 2 in the morning. He told himself he was checking the perimeter camera feeds from the upper hallway panel. That was true. He checked them. Everything was quiet, fresh snow covering the tire tracks from the vehicles, the forest beyond the fence dark and still. Then he walked past the east guest room. The door was slightly ajar. Mrs. Harlan had left it that way deliberately, he suspected, so the warmth from the hallway could reach inside. He slowed. Stopped. Through the gap, he could see the lamp still burning low. Gracelyn had pushed back the covers in her sleep and curled onto her side. One arm stretched out across the pillow, the teddy bear tucked under her chin. Her breathing was slow and even. Her cheeks had recovered their color. The desperate red rawness from the cold had softened into something that looked, finally, like rest. She looked like any child. She looked like safety had always been available to her, and she had simply chosen, tonight, to use it. Nolan stood in the hallway outside the door of his own house and felt something move through him that he had no current language for. It wasn't guilt. He had processed guilt into something more functional long ago. It wasn't pity. Pity required distance. This was closer. This was the memory of a yellow coat and a hospital corridor arriving without permission and refusing, for once, to be filed away. His sister had been 12. This girl was 6. He pulled the door gently closed and stood in the dark hallway for a moment, with his hand still resting on the frame. Was this coincidence? His entire career had been built on the foundational understanding that in his world, coincidence was almost always something else wearing a convincing disguise. Gracelyn Waters, the daughter of the man whose empire he had broken, found in his forest. On his road, within reach of his gate. On a night he had driven alone. On a road he rarely used. The vehicles that came to the perimeter and waited, and left. She wasn't hiding from strangers. The thought arrived quietly, the way the most unsettling thoughts always did, not as a shout, but as a whisper that kept getting louder. She was hiding from someone who knew exactly where she was. His phone vibrated. A message from his security lead. 4 words only. She has a name. Below it, a photograph. A woman stepping out of a vehicle at a roadside motel, 12 miles from the estate. Composed, exhausted. Eyes that carried something heavier than fear. Nina Waters. She was already looking for her daughter. And by morning, Nolan understood with cold certainty she would find her way to his door. She came at dawn, Not in the chaotic, desperate way Nolan had prepared himself for. No pounding on gates, no screaming his name into the cold morning air. Nina Waters arrived the way people arrive when they have already survived the worst part and are now simply moving through what remains. One black sedan, no escort. She stepped out into the pale gray light with her coat pulled close, and her chin level and her eyes doing the same thing her daughter's eyes had done in the forest, cataloging, assessing, giving nothing away for free. Nolan watched her on the monitor for a moment before he gave the order to open the gates. She was 31, but carried herself older, not aged, tempered, the way certain materials get stronger under prolonged heat. Her dark hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about appearances somewhere around the third consecutive sleepless night. There were shadows beneath her eyes that makeup hadn't touched. Her jaw was set with the particular tension of a person who has rehearsed a conversation so many times that the actual moment of it feels both familiar and impossible. She walked through the gate without being invited to hurry. They brought her to the main sitting room, not his office, not the formal reception hall. He had chosen this deliberately. Neutral ground, nothing behind the desk to remind either of them of the architecture of power between them. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him. He stood near the window with his hands at his sides, still in the dark clothes from the previous night, and he watched her take him in the same way he was taking her in. The tattoos, the posture, the particular quality of stillness that men like him developed, not calm, exactly, but controlled in a way that required constant maintenance. He saw her absorb all of it. He saw her decide, visibly, to remain standing. "Where is she?" Nina said. Her voice was steady. Whatever it had cost her to make it steady was not visible. "Sleeping," Nolan said. "She's safe. She wasn't harmed." Something crossed Nina's face, a fracture, swiftly sealed. The involuntary response of a mother hearing the word safe applied to her child after a night of not knowing. "I want to see her." "You will." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down first." She looked at the chair, then at him. The calculation behind her eyes was clear. She was weighing what refusal would cost her against what compliance might surrender. She sat. She didn't ask how Gracelyn had ended up in his forest. She didn't ask why he had stopped his car, or brought the child here, or not contacted authorities. She asked none of the questions an ordinary person in her position would have led with. That told him more than an hour of conversation would have. She knew why those questions had obvious answers. "You know who I am," Nolan said. "Yes." "Then you know this conversation requires honesty. From both of us." Nina looked at him with those exhausted, measuring eyes. "I didn't bring her there," she said. "I want you to understand that. We were forced off a road 12 miles east. There were 3 vehicles. They separated us. I don't know how she got that far. She must have run when they..." She stopped. Reset. "She's 6 years old and she ran through a blizzard because I told her to hide and not stop running." The room held that for a moment. "Who were they?" Nolan asked. Nina's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. "That's what I came here to tell you." She paused. "All of it." She spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. Marcus, she said, had not been what Nolan believed him to be. Not fully. Yes, he had operated in shadow finance. Yes, he had moved money for dangerous people. But the scale of it, the real machinery underneath, had not been Marcus's architecture. He had been a component, a skilled, well-compensated component inside a structure built and controlled by someone else. Someone who needed a credible face that could absorb consequences if the structure was ever examined too closely. Marcus had realized this late, too late. He had spent the final year of his life quietly gathering evidence, transaction records, coded communications, offshore account trails, evidence that pointed not outward toward rivals or competitors, but inward, into Nolan's own organization. Nolan kept his expression still. He discovered, Nina continued, her voice careful and precise, that the person coordinating his operation, the person who recruited him, managed him, and eventually decided he had become a liability, held a position inside your network. The silence in the room changed quality. "He was going to bring what he found to you directly," she said. "He believed that if you knew, you would..." She stopped. Something complicated moved through her face. "He died before he could." Nolan said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the morning light was strengthening, pale winter sun catching the snow in the garden and turning it briefly luminous. "You have the evidence," he said. It wasn't a question. Everything he gathered. She reached into her coat and produced a folded document, printed pages, dense with figures and account strings and dates. She set it on the table between them. There's more. Encrypted files. I have access codes. He looked at the document without touching it. Why bring this to me? He asked. Knowing what I am. Knowing what happened to your husband. Nina met his eyes directly. Because the person who wants Gracelyn and me dead is inside your house. Her voice didn't waver. And you're the only person with the authority to stop them. The words landed with the particular weight of things that rearrange the furniture of a man's understanding. Before he could respond, there was movement in the doorway. Small, quick, certain. Gracelyn, pink coat, teddy bear, hair still sleep-tangled, crossed the room at speed, bypassing her mother entirely, and wrapped both arms around Nolan's leg. She pressed her face against his knee and held on. The room went absolutely still. Nina stared. Not with anger, with something rawer than that. The expression of a mother watching her child choose comfort from the last source she had expected. Nolan looked down at Gracelyn. Then, slowly, he placed one tattooed hand gently on the back of her small head. He looked back at Nina. Show me everything, he said. The document spread across Nolan's desk like an autopsy. He had sent Nina to rest, not a request, exactly, but framed gently enough that she had accepted it without argument. Mrs. Harlan had taken Gracelyn to the kitchen for breakfast, and through the partially open office door, Nolan could hear the distant, ordinary sound of a child asking questions about a toaster. The mundane contrast of it against what was laid out in front of him felt almost offensive. He read everything twice. Then he pulled his own records. The offshore accounts Nina had documented were not unfamiliar to him, not entirely. Several of the routing numbers appeared in the peripheral architecture of his own financial network, in the outer rings where legitimate business and shadow operation blurred deliberately. He had always known those edges existed. He had trusted the men who managed them to keep them clean. That trust, it appeared, had been the vulnerability. The transfers Marcus had traced were surgical, small enough individually to avoid triggering internal review, frequent enough collectively to represent a significant and sustained extraction. Someone had been running a secondary operation through the membrane of Nolan's organization using his infrastructure, his credibility, his protective shadow to move money for interests that had nothing to do with his own. And Marcus Waters had found it, and Marcus Waters had died on an icy road. Nolan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word coincidence and how thoroughly he was done with it. He cross-referenced dates. The timeline was precise and damning. Marcus had begun gathering evidence 14 months before his death. The car accident had occurred 11 days after Marcus had made a documented attempt to arrange a private meeting with one of Nolan's senior people. The meeting had never happened. The request, apparently, had never been passed along. Someone had intercepted it. Someone who understood exactly what Marcus knowing meant for them. He was still at his desk an hour later when Gracelyn appeared in the doorway. She had acquired, somewhere between the kitchen and the office, a piece of toast that she was eating with both hands and considerable commitment. She looked at him. He looked at her. She walked in without being invited, which he noted, and climbed onto the chair across from his desk with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had decided the room was available to her. She sat with her feet dangling too short to reach the floor and regarded him across the expanse of his desk with those blue eyes that seemed constitutionally incapable of pretending. "What are all those papers?" she asked. "Work," he said. "Mommy does work papers too." She took a bite of toast. "She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping." Nolan said nothing. He looked at the child sitting in his office eating toast while evidence of betrayal was spread across every surface between them, and felt the particular specific weight of what it meant that she was here at all. "Gracelyn." He kept his voice measured. "The men who were arguing that night, did you see any of them? Before your mother told you to run?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. One of them had a loud voice. Mommy went very still when she heard it. She paused. "Like when you hear something scary but you don't want them to know you heard it?" "Did she say his name?" Gracelyn shook her head, then stopped. She said, "Not him." Like that. "Not him." And then she grabbed my hand. "Not him." The particular horror of recognition someone expected to be safe, revealed as the source of danger. Nolan looked at the documents on his desk. He called his security lead mid-morning and gave instructions that were precise and limited in their disclosure. He needed movement logs for the past 18 months, cross-referenced against the account activity dates Nina had provided. He needed them pulled quietly, from internal records only, without triggering any shared system alerts. The man he trusted with this had been with him for 9 years. Nolan ran the same calculus on him that he was now running on everyone, measuring known history against new information, looking for gaps where certainty had existed before, and finding, in most cases, that the certainty held. In most cases. 3 hours later, the movement logs arrived. He spread them against Nina's timeline and found what he had been both looking for and hoping not to find. A name surfaced with the consistency of a pattern that had been careful enough to avoid attention individually but was, when assembled in full, unmistakable. His lieutenant. 8 years of service. A man who had stood in rooms with Nolan during the worst moments this organization had survived. A man who knew the internal architecture of Nolan's operation better than almost anyone alive. A man who had been present. The logs confirmed it at 3 of the critical transfer windows Marcus had documented. A man who had been on duty the night of Marcus's fatal accident. A man who had been on perimeter rotation the night Nolan found Gracelyn in the forest. The blizzard rescue didn't feel accidental anymore. It felt managed. Gracelyn had not wandered into his territory by chance. She had been driven there, perhaps literally, perhaps through the deliberate manipulation of the pursuit, because having her inside Nolan's walls served a purpose. A child connected to Marcus Waters, sheltered by Nolan Stevens, created exposure, created complication, created the kind of situation that, handled incorrectly, could be used against him, or used to eliminate loose ends under his own roof. He was still processing this when he heard it. A sound from the east wing, brief, sharp, wrong. Then his security system screamed. Nolan was out of his chair before the second alarm tone sounded, moving fast through the corridor, his hand finding the gun at his hip with the automatic muscle memory of 15 years. The noise was coming from the direction of the guest rooms. He came around the corner and found 2 of his men already in the hallway positioned, weapons raised, facing a figure at the far end, his lieutenant, standing very still, with an expression that had stopped pretending. The air in the corridor went the specific temperature of things that cannot be taken back. Nolan looked at the man who had stood beside him for 8 years. He looked at Gracelyn's door, 6 feet away, closed. He looked back. "Don't," Nolan said. One word. Quiet as snow. The lieutenant's hand moved anyway. Gunfire shattered the silence of the estate, like something that had been waiting, patient and inevitable, to finally arrive. The first shot hit the wall. Not aimed at Nolan, aimed past him, toward the corridor junction. A suppression round designed to create movement, to scatter, to divide attention. Nolan recognized the tactic because he had designed it himself, years ago, for exactly this kind of interior engagement. His lieutenant had learned it from him. That knowledge arrived with a specific bitterness. He moved left hard and fast against the wall as his 2 men returned fire down the corridor. The lieutenant had already pulled back around the far corner, using the estate's own architecture as cover the way only someone who had walked these halls 1,000 times would know to do. Nolan pressed his back to the plaster and breathed once, deliberately, and assessed. 3 variables. His men were positioned between him and the threat. Good. Nina and Gracelyn were behind Gracelyn's door, 6 feet to his right. Unknown. The lieutenant had not come alone. That last variable arrived as confirmation rather than surprise. A second figure appeared at the corridor's far end, moving to flank, and Nolan's security lead was already redirecting to cover it. The estate had 12 interior cameras. Nolan's men had access to all of them. The lieutenant knew this, which meant he had either disabled feeds before making his move, or he had accepted that speed mattered more than invisibility. Acceptance of visibility meant he wasn't planning to stay long. In and out, one objective. Nolan looked at Gracelyn's door. He crossed the 6 feet in 2 steps, turned the handle, and pushed through into the room, pulling the door shut behind him in one continuous motion. Nina was already standing. She had moved Gracelyn to the far corner, the child pressed behind her. Nina's arm extended backward in the instinctive geometry of a mother placing her body between her child and whatever was coming. She was pale but not frozen. Her eyes went to Nolan's gun, then to his face. "How many?" she said. "At least 2 in the corridor. Possibly more at exterior access points." He moved to the window, checked the latch, checked the ground below. 2nd floor. Garden directly beneath. Snow-covered, clear of movement. "This room has 1 exit point they'll expect us to use. We're not using it. Then how?" "There's a service stairwell behind the panel in the adjoining bathroom. It runs to the lower kitchen exit. My men know to create enough engagement in the corridor to give us the window." He looked at Gracelyn. She was pressed against Nina's side, Both arms wrapped around her mother's waist, the bear crushed between them. Her eyes were on Nolan, wide, frightened, but not panicked. She was holding herself together with a composure that a 6-year-old should not have needed to develop. And the specific injustice of that, the fact that this child had clearly learned, in her short life, how to survive frightening things, quietly moved through him like something hot. He crossed to her, crouched down. "Gracelyn." His voice came out low and even. "I need you to be very quiet and very fast. Can you do that for me?" She looked at him for 1 second, nodded. "Good girl." He held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. The service panel opened inward on a narrow stairwell that smelled of old stone and disuse. Nolan went first, gun raised, clearing each landing before signaling Nina forward. She moved well, no unnecessary sound, no wasted motion, and he filed that away without comment. Gracelyn descended each step with focused concentration, her small hand maintaining its grip on his, with a steadiness that he found, in the compressed urgency of the moment, extraordinary. They reached the lower level. The kitchen exit opened onto the east side of the garden, away from the main approach vectors. Nolan's security lead was already there, materialized from the interior engagement with the efficiency of someone who had been given precise instructions and followed them precisely. "Corridor is clear," the man said quietly. "One detained. One fled the perimeter. We have eyes on him heading north on foot." "The lieutenant?" A pause. "Detained." Nolan looked at Nina. She was holding Gracelyn now, the child's face pressed into her shoulder, and she was looking at Nolan over the top of her daughter's head with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: relief, exhaustion, and something that might, in better circumstances, have been called gratitude but was currently too raw for that word. "Is it over?" Nina asked. "This part," Nolan said. He had them move to the secure lower suite reinforced door, internal camera access, no exterior windows. "Mrs. Harlan appeared within minutes with tea, and the expression of a woman who had decided that maintaining normalcy was the only sane response to impossible circumstances. She set the tray down, smoothed Gracelyn's hair once with a gentle hand, and left without speaking. Gracelyn sat on the sofa with her bear and her tea and said nothing for a long time. Then, "He was one of the men from the forest." Both adults went still. "The loud voice," she said. She wasn't looking at either of them, she was looking at the bear, turning it slowly in her hands. "From when Mommy said not him, that was his voice, in the corridor." Nina closed her eyes briefly. Nolan sat down in the chair across from Gracelyn. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the same posture he'd used in the forest, bringing himself closer to her level, and looked at her with the full attention she deserved. "You're safe," he said. "He won't come near you again." She looked up at him. Something moved through her small face, a processing, a settling. "You didn't run," she said. "When the loud noises came, you came here instead." He held her gaze. "Yes." "Why?" The question was simple and direct, and landed somewhere in him that had not been accessible for a very long time. He thought about the correct answer, the tactical answer, the strategic answer, and discarded both. "Because you were here," he said. Gracelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she climbed off the sofa, crossed the space between them, and sat down beside him with her bear in her lap and her small shoulder pressed against his arm. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Nolan sat in the silence she had made, and felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, not with the violence of the corridor still ringing in his ears, but quietly, deliberately, the way a man shifts when he has just chosen, without fully realizing it, who he is going to be. The lieutenant talked by midnight, not because Nolan broke him, though the infrastructure for that existed and the man knew it. He talked because men who build their entire identity around being indispensable to someone powerful find, when that power is suddenly directed at them rather than deployed beside them, that the architecture of their loyalty was always conditional. Strip away the protection, remove the umbrella, and what remains is just a man in a cold room, with nowhere left to position himself. Nolan sat across from him in the basement holding room and said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. He had learned this from an older man, years ago, that silence applied to a guilty person functions like water applied to a crack in stone. It doesn't force entry, it simply finds the existing weakness and works with patience until the structure gives. The lieutenant gave. His name was Garrett. 8 years of service. He had been present at the founding of 3 of Nolan's most significant operations. He had stood in hospitals, in courtrooms, in foreign cities, always at the peripheral edge of whatever Nolan was navigating, always reliable, always composed, always there. Nolan had trusted him the way you trust something that has never yet failed, not with examination, but with assumption. That, Garrett explained, with the flat affect of someone beyond the point of performance, had been the entry point. The external organization, the one Marcus had been laundering for, the one whose architecture ran beneath Nolan's like a shadow root system, had approached Garrett 6 years ago. Not with threats, with access, with the particular seduction of feeling more important than your position allows. Garrett had been offered a view of the larger machinery, a seat at a table that didn't officially exist, compensation that moved through accounts Nolan would never see. He had accepted. For 6 years he had managed the double architecture with the same precision he applied to everything. Nolan's operation above, the shadow network below. One feeding credibility and cover to the other. Marcus Waters had gotten close enough to the shadow network's financial trails to identify Garrett by account behavior, if not by name. Garrett had known this, had moved to contain it, had coordinated the road that Marcus died on. Nolan listened to this with his hands folded on the table and his expression giving nothing. "And the girl," he said. "Gracelyn." Garrett looked at his hands. "Nina Waters had the documents Marcus compiled. We'd been tracking her for months. She kept moving. When we finally had a location, the decision was made to," he stopped, recalibrated, "to resolve it. To kill a woman and her 6-year-old child." The word resolve sat between them like something that needed to be looked at directly. Garrett said nothing. "The forest," Nolan said. "You were on perimeter rotation that night." "Yes." "You knew my route." "Yes." "You drove them toward my territory deliberately." A pause. Then, "If she was found inside your perimeter, if the child ended up connected to you, it created exposure. It complicated your position. It gave us options for how to handle the situation under your roof, without it pointing back to you," Nolan said. "To the organization." Nolan stood. He walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to Garrett for a moment, looking at the wall. He was thinking about a 6-year-old girl clutching a teddy bear against a tree in a blizzard, and about how that image, which he had initially read as tragedy and coincidence, had actually been a calculated move on a board he hadn't known he was sitting on. He had been a piece, moved by someone else's hand. The empire he had built on the foundational principle of control had been, in its most critical interior, outside his control for 6 years. He left Garrett in the room and drove to the docks alone. This was not the plan his security lead had recommended. The recommendation had involved numbers, coverage, tactical positioning. Nolan had listened to all of it, and then driven to the docks alone, because there were moments that required solitude, not for safety reasons, but for honest ones. He needed to be somewhere without walls that belonged to him, where none of the architecture was his, where he could stand in the open and think without the weight of ownership pressing down from every surface. The docks at this hour were stripped clean of activity. Snow was coming down again, lighter than the blizzard, more considered. Large flakes drifting with the deliberate slowness of things that have all the time they need. The water was dark and flat beneath the dock lights, edged with thin ice at the pilings. The cold here was different from the forest cold, sharper, carrying salt and metal, the smell of commerce and distance. He stood at the water's edge and thought about Marcus Waters. A man he had dismantled without fully knowing what he was dismantling. A man who had been trying, in the end, to do the right thing, gathering evidence, planning exposure, moving toward a door that someone had made sure he never reached. A man whose 6-year-old daughter had pressed her face into Nolan's knee and held on. He thought about the Empire, about what it was built from: fear, precision, loyalty maintained through consequence. He had always understood it as a clean system, functional, self-sustaining. He had never fully examined what lived inside it because the results had always, until now, confirmed his confidence in its structure. The results, it turned out, had been partially falsified. He pulled out his phone. He made 4 calls in sequence, each one short, specific, irreversible. By the time the 4th call ended, the process of dismantling Garrett's shadow network had begun. Accounts flagged, access revoked, 3 key external contacts informed in language that left no room for negotiation. He was burning it down. Not because he had been told to, not because someone more powerful had forced his hand, but because, standing at the edge of dark water and falling snow, he understood with cold clarity that the rot hadn't entered his organization from outside. He had created the conditions for it. Fear breeds loyalty only until it breeds something else entirely. He looked at the water for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to his vehicle. He had a child to return to, and for the first time in 15 years, that felt like the most important direction. Nina was awake when he returned. She was sitting in the chair beside Gracelyn's bed in the secure suite, her legs drawn up beneath her, a cold cup of tea on the side table that suggested she had made the intention to drink it and then forgotten. Gracelyn was asleep, properly asleep this time, the deep, unguarded sleep of a child who has finally decided that the immediate world is safe enough to surrender to. She was on her back with both arms above her head, the bear wedged under her chin, her lips slightly parted. Nolan stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment before Nina became aware of him. When she did, she didn't startle. She simply unfolded herself from the chair and followed him out into the corridor, pulling the door almost closed behind her, leaving the same careful gap. Mrs. Harlan always left. Garrett talked, Nolan said. I know. She wrapped her arms around herself, not cold, contained. Your security lead told me the corridor was clear. I assumed the rest. He confirmed everything in your documents, the shadow network, Marcus discovering it, the accident. He paused. He confirmed Marcus tried to bring the information to my organization directly, that the attempt was intercepted. Nina looked at the wall. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to control, grief arriving not as fresh injury, but as the particular exhaustion of a wound that has been managed for so long that the management itself has become its own kind of pain. He tried, she said quietly. That's what I kept, the fact that he tried. Nolan said nothing. He waited. She told him the rest, standing in the corridor outside their daughter's door, speaking in the low, precise voice of someone who has rehearsed this testimony in their own head so many times that the emotion has been worn into the structure of the sentences rather than sitting on top of them. Marcus had known, she said, for almost 2 years before his death, that he was in too deep to simply walk away. The organization using him wasn't the kind that accepted resignation. He had understood that the only exit available to him was through exposure, to make the information public enough, place it in hands powerful enough, that eliminating him would create more problems than it solved. He had been methodical, careful. He had gathered evidence across 14 months, without alerting anyone he worked with that anything had changed. He had kept Nina outside the knowledge entirely, not because he didn't trust her, but because he understood that what she didn't know couldn't be extracted from her. He had planned to disappear their family first, then deliver the evidence. He had run out of time by 11 days. He was a good man, Nina said. Not defensively, factually. I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm telling you because it's true, and because he isn't here to say it himself. Nolan looked at her. I believe it. She met his eyes. Whatever she found there seemed to cost her something. The careful neutrality she had maintained since arriving at his gates developed a crack along one edge. He was also afraid, she said. For the last year, he was afraid every single day. He just didn't let Gracelyn see it. The corridor was very quiet. She saw it anyway, Nolan said. Children always do. Nina's jaw tightened. She nodded once. He left her at the door and walked to his study, and sat in the dark for a long time without turning on a light. He was thinking about fathers, about the particular specific courage it requires to be afraid every day on behalf of someone small, and to continue functioning, to continue appearing at breakfast, to continue building something that might protect them even after you're gone. Marcus had gathered evidence for 14 months, while knowing that discovery meant death. He had done it in the margins of a life that had to appear unchanged. Same meetings, same front, same face. He had done it for a 6-year-old girl with blue eyes who clutched a teddy bear and told frightening men that they weren't scary. Nolan thought about his own life, about what he had built and what it had cost, and who, at the end of any given day, it had ever actually protected. The answer arrived with an honesty he hadn't extended to himself in years. Nobody. He had built an empire of protection that protected the empire. He had become the thing Marcus Waters had been running from, not the man himself, but the system, the machinery of power that consumed people and called it order. He heard her before he saw her, small feet on the study floor. The particular soft, irregular sound of someone very young, navigating an unfamiliar room in the dark. He turned. Gracelyn stood at the edge of the lamplight in her oversized borrowed pajamas, bare under one arm, hair thoroughly disordered by sleep. She was not fully awake. Her eyes had the heavy, unfocused quality of someone operating on instinct rather than intention. She crossed the room and climbed onto the sofa beside his chair without asking permission or offering explanation. She pulled her knees up, settled the bear, and put her head down on the sofa arm. Within 40 seconds, she was breathing slowly again. She had woken, found him gone from the general vicinity, and come to find him. Nolan sat in his chair in the dark and looked at this child sleeping on his sofa and felt something happen in his chest that he had no precedent for, not the fracture from the forest, not the quiet shift from the corridor, but something larger than both, something that wasn't breaking but building, something that felt, with a clarity that frightened him slightly, like responsibility chosen rather than assigned. He reached over and pulled the blanket from the sofa back across her. She murmured something without waking. He sat back. Outside the study window, the snow was still falling patient and indifferent and clean, covering everything with the same quiet consistency it had covered everything for days. Nolan looked at it and thought about Marcus Waters building something in the dark to protect his daughter. Thought about what it meant to do that. Thought about what it required. Then he thought about what he was going to do next. The decision arrived without drama, without the weight he might have expected from something this size. It arrived the way true decisions sometimes do, not as a conclusion reached after deliberation, but as a recognition of something already determined, already present, simply waiting to be acknowledged. He was not going to tighten his grip. He was going to do the opposite. He looked at Gracelyn sleeping on his sofa, at the bear tucked under her arm, at the small rise and fall of her breathing in the lamplight. "I was the one who was lost," he said quietly. To no one. To the room. To the snow outside. He meant it. Nina appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. She took in the scene, her daughter asleep on the sofa, the blanket, Nolan sitting in the chair beside her in the dark with an expression that moved through several things before settling into something unguarded and honest. She looked at Nolan. "You didn't just find her in the forest," she said softly. "Did you?" It wasn't a question. Nolan looked at Gracelyn, at the bear, at the lamp casting its small circle of warmth against all that surrounding dark. "No," he said. Nina stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked to the other chair and sat down. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The three of them remained there, man, woman, sleeping child, in the quiet lamplight, while the snow came down outside, and something that had been broken for a long time in that room began, without announcement, to breathe again. He began before dawn, while the estate was still dark and Gracelyn was still asleep, and Nina sat at the kitchen table with coffee that Mrs. Harlan had produced with the wordless efficiency of someone who understood that this morning required sustenance more than ceremony. Nolan sat at his desk and began the process of taking apart what he had built, not destroying it, restructuring it. He had spent 15 years constructing an organization that operated in shadow, because shadow had been the only architecture available to a 20-year-old with nothing except intelligence, nerve, and the particular desperation that comes from watching everything you love become vulnerable. He had built walls because walls had kept things out. He had built fear because fear had kept people in line. He had built and built and built until the building itself had become the point, until he had confused the fortress with the life it was supposed to protect. The fortress, it turned out, had been rotten in its interior for 6 years, and no amount of external reinforcement fixes rot from within. He started with the financial architecture. His legitimate front operations, 4 of them, spread across property development, logistics, private security consulting, and import distribution, were genuinely profitable. They had always been genuinely profitable. They had simply been used, in their peripheral edges, as cover and conduit for the shadow network underneath. Remove the shadow network, sever the conduit. What remained was a collection of functioning, legitimate businesses that could stand without the infrastructure of fear propping them up. He called his financial director at 5 in the morning. The man answered on the second ring. Years of working for Nolan had recalibrated his relationship with conventional hours. Nolan told him what he needed. Not as a question, not as a proposal, as a set of instructions to be executed with the same precision that every instruction had always been executed. There was a long pause on the line. Then, all of it? All of it, Nolan said. By mid-morning, he had made 11 calls and sent documentation that would, over the following days, begin severing every connection between his organization and the shadow network Garrett had maintained. External contacts were notified. Accounts were flagged for dissolution. 3 operations that existed purely in gray space, no legitimate cover, no clean financial trail, were simply closed. The people running them were given severance and made aware, in language that was polite and absolute, that their association with Nolan Stevens was concluded. 2 of them pushed back. Nolan took those calls personally. They did not push back twice. Nina found him at his desk at noon. She had Gracelyn with her. The child was wearing one of Nolan's estate sweatshirts as a dress, which she appeared to find entirely satisfactory, and was carrying both the bear and a drawing she had apparently made during the morning, with materials Mrs. Harlan had located from somewhere in the estate's considerable storage. She crossed to Nolan's desk and placed the drawing on top of his papers, with the gravity of someone presenting important documentation. He looked at it. 2 figures in the snow, one tall, one small. The tall one had dark marks on its neck, crayon approximations of his tattoos, rendered with considerable effort and moderate accuracy. They were holding hands. Above them, in careful, uneven letters that suggested recent and determined practice, Nolan and me. Nolan looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through him that arrived without warning and required a moment to process. Not sadness, not exactly, though it lived in the same neighborhood. More like the feeling of a window opening in a room that has been sealed for so long the air inside had stopped being noticed. "She's been working on it since breakfast," Nina said quietly. "She wouldn't let me help with the spelling." He looked at Gracelyn. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone awaiting a verdict on something that mattered. "It's very accurate," he said. She broke into a smile that was, objectively, the most uncomplicated thing Nolan Stevens had encountered in 15 years of operating in spaces where nothing was uncomplicated. He told Nina that afternoon what he was doing, not as a confession, not seeking absolution, as information she deserved to have, delivered plainly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What happens to your people?" she asked. "The ones who've been with you legitimately. The legitimate operations keep running. The people who've been running them keep their positions. What changes is what those operations are connected to." He paused. "And what they're used for." She looked at him. "And protection? For the people who need it? Already arranged." He held her gaze. "For everyone who needs it." She understood what he meant. He saw it arrive in her expression, not relief. Exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a weight that has been carried alone for a long time, being acknowledged by someone else. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know." "Then why?" He thought about Marcus Waters building evidence in the dark, about a girl running barefoot through a blizzard because her mother told her to hide, about a child who climbed onto his sofa at midnight because she'd woken up and found him gone and simply came to find him, as though his presence was already something she had decided to rely on. "Because someone has to," he said. The snow came back on a quiet morning. Not the blizzard, nothing like the blizzard. This was the other kind of snow, the kind that arrives without announcement and falls with the unhurried patience of something that has no argument to make, no point to prove. Large, soft flakes drifting straight down through still air, settling on the garden with a gentleness that made the whole estate feel temporarily outside of time. Gracelyn saw it first. She was at the breakfast table when it began, and she went still in the particular way. Children go still when something outside claims their entire attention spoon suspended halfway to her mouth. Eyes locked on the window, expression shifting through wonder with the transparency that only very young faces allow. "It's snowing again," she announced, as though reporting a personal gift. "I see that," Mrs. Harlan said, not looking up from the stove. Gracelyn looked at Nolan. He was already watching her. "Can we go outside?" she asked. They built the snowman in the east garden. It was Gracelyn's design, which meant the proportions were entirely her own and not subject to revision. The base was substantial. She had been emphatic about the base, and the middle section was smaller than convention suggested, and the head was arguably too large, and the whole construction leaned approximately 12 degrees to the left in a way that Gracelyn had assessed and decided gave it character. Nolan had not argued any of these points. He was crouched in the snow in the garden of his own estate, pressing snow into shapes at the direction of a 6-year-old, wearing no coat because his coat was currently serving as the snowman's, draped across its lopsided shoulders at Gracelyn's instruction. His tattooed hands were packed with cold. His breath was coming in visible clouds in the winter air. He was, by any observable measure, entirely present. Nina watched from the terrace. She had a coffee she was actually drinking this time warm, held in both hands, and she stood at the stone railing and watched the two of them below in the garden. Gracelyn was attempting to instruct Nolan in the correct placement of a stick arm, and Nolan was listening with the focused attention he appeared to give everything, which in this context looked less like control and more like genuine interest in getting the stick arm right. She had spent 2 years building a life around the absence of Marcus, around Gracelyn not having a father, around herself not having a partner. She had built that life carefully, without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury that single mothers running from dangerous people could not afford. She had not built it with space for this. She wasn't sure what this was yet. She suspected she didn't need to define it today. Below in the garden, Gracelyn said something that made Nolan laugh, actually laugh. A real one, brief and unguarded, that changed his face entirely, stripped away the controlled surface, and revealed something underneath that looked younger and less complicated, and more alive. Nina held her coffee and looked at that face. She thought about the man she had driven to his gates ready to hate. She had prepared for that hatred the way you prepare for something necessary, steeled herself, structured her arguments, decided in advance that whatever she felt when she saw him, she would not let it interfere with what she had to do. She had not prepared for this. He came to the terrace when Gracelyn, satisfied with the snowman's completion, had returned inside with Mrs. Harlan for hot chocolate negotiated through the kind of charming persistence that Mrs. Harlan pretended to resist and clearly didn't. He stood beside Nina at the railing and looked at the snowman in the garden. It was listing further left now, the stick arms at uneven angles, the coat around its shoulders slowly accumulating its own layer of new snow. "She's going to name it," Nina said. "She already did," Nolan said. "Gerald." Nina looked at him. "Gerald." She was very certain about it. She shook her head slowly. A sound escaped her that was close to a laugh, not the performance of one, but the real thing, brief and surprised, arriving before she could organize it into something more composed. He looked at her when it happened. She saw him look. "I came here ready to hate you," she said. She had said this before, in a different context, but it meant something different now. "I know," he said. "You weren't what I expected." He was quiet for a moment. Below them, Gerald the snowman stood in the garden with his coat and his character and his 12-degree lean, and the snow continued to fall around him, with complete indifference to everything that had happened in the days preceding his construction. "I wasn't what I expected either," Nolan said. Nina turned to look at him directly. "What happens now?" He considered the question honestly, which was the only way he currently knew how to consider anything. "The operations run clean," he said. "The protection holds. Garrett faces consequences that don't require me to become what he was." He paused. "And Gerald probably doesn't survive the week if the temperature rises." "I meant for us," Nina said quietly. Nolan looked at her. At the steadiness in her face, the exhaustion still present, honestly, but underneath it something that had begun to look like ground. Solid ground, the kind you can build on. "I know what you meant," he said. He looked back at the garden, at Gerald, at the snow still falling through the pale winter light. "Stay," he said, simply, without conditions or architecture or the language of strategy. Just the word, offered plainly. Nina was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned back to the garden and stood beside him at the railing, and they remained there together, while the snow came down, and the morning held still around them, and Gerald listed gently to the left. "You didn't just save her life," she said finally. "You changed it." He thought about a forest road and a pink coat, and 4 words that had split something open in him. He thought about what had grown in the split. He thought about Marcus Waters and yellow coats and hospital corridors, and the long specific cost of being the kind of man who builds walls and calls them homes. He looked at the snow. "I was the one who was lost," he said, and the morning held that quietly, without judgment, the way honest things are held when they finally get said while the snow fell soft and clean over everything, covering the hard edges of the world in something that looked, this time, not like isolation, like beginning. "Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.
Если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов в принципе-то и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то, еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей. Да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушки такой, который у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такой вот. И эта борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да. Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот, и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там, Новстрой, задав ему этот вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку